Hundreds of millions of people went to bed in one country and woke up in another without knowing where the border was, not because it was disputed, not because it was secret, because it didn't officially exist yet. On the morning of August 15th, 1947, the line that would decide which nation your home, your farm, your temple, your mosque, even your family belonged to had not been made public. It wouldn't be for another 2 days. Now sit with that for a second. Imagine celebrating the single most important night of your nation's history, the end of nearly 100 years of colonial rule, the birth of independence itself, without knowing which country you actually belonged to. Was your city about to become part of India or Pakistan? Nobody could tell you. Not your neighbors, not your local officials, not even the men who had negotiated the terms of independence. The answer existed only in a locked file, drawn up by a British lawyer who had arrived in the country 5 weeks earlier and had never set foot in India before in his life. So here's the question worth sitting with before we go any further. How do you divide a civilization? Not a company, not a colony, an actual interconnected 1,000-year-old civilization of nearly 400 million people in 5 weeks? And what happens to the human beings living inside that civilization when the people drawing the line get it catastrophically, irreversibly wrong? What happens to a family that has lived in the same house for 6 generations when a stranger, using a 5-week-old map, decides overnight which country that house now belongs to? This is the story of the Partition of India, the single largest mass migration in recorded human history. A border that, by the most conservative estimates, cost at least 200,000 lives, and by others, as many as 2 million. A line that tore families, villages, and religious communities apart literally overnight, and whose consequences are still actively shaping geopolitics, nuclear tension, and the daily lives of well over 1 billion people today. Let's go through exactly how it happened. If this kind of deep historical reconstruction is what you're here for, hit like and subscribe before we get into it. Because what follows is one of the most consequential 5-week stretches in the entire 20th century. To understand the scale of what was about to be destroyed, you have to understand what British India actually was on the eve of partition. This wasn't a patchwork of separate hostile nations waiting to be sorted into their natural groupings. It was a single, deeply interwoven subcontinent, roughly 400 million people, encompassing what is today India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and dozens of other communities had lived, traded, farmed, and in countless cases intermarried across the same streets and villages for generations. In cities like Lahore, Delhi, and Calcutta, Hindu and Muslim merchants shared business partnerships that had passed down through multiple generations of the same families. In the Ain-Powys, Punjab, the breadbasket region, that would become the epicenter of the violence to come, Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu farmers worked adjoining fields irrigated by the same canal systems that had been engineered as a single integrated network, not a separate national infrastructure. Ask yourself, how do you draw a hard international border through an irrigation system? Through a shared marketplace? Through a city where the mosque and the temple sit 2 streets apart and have for 400 years? Consider Lahore alone. For centuries, it had functioned as one of the great cultural and intellectual capitals of the entire subcontinent. A city where Mughal architecture, Sikh political history, and a thriving, long-established Hindu merchant and professional class all occupied the same streets, the same institutions, the same social fabric. Consider Delhi, where Muslim poets, Hindu traders, and Sikh craftsmen had built overlapping neighborhoods across centuries of shared urban life. None of this was some fragile, artificial peace imposed from outside. It was simply how the subcontinent had functioned in its immense religious and linguistic diversity for the better part of a millennium under various empires, long before the British East India Company ever set foot on its shores. That question wasn't hypothetical. It was exactly the problem handed to the man who would eventually draw the line. And it's worth understanding why the decision to partition happened at all before we get to how badly it was executed. By the mid-1940s, the movement for Indian independence had fractured along a political fault line that had been widening for 2 decades. The Indian National Congress, led by figures like Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, envisioned a single, unified, secular India. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had grown increasingly convinced that Muslims would become a permanently disadvantaged minority inside a Hindu-majority state and pushed instead for a separate Muslim homeland, Pakistan. In August 1946, Jinnah called for what he termed Direct Action Day, intended as a mass political demonstration. In Calcutta, it exploded into 4 days of communal massacre, what came to be called the Great Calcutta Killings, leaving thousands dead, and effectively confirming, in the eyes of many on both sides, that Hindus and Muslims could no longer safely share a single unified state. By the time Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived in India in early 1947 as the last British viceroy, tasked with overseeing the transfer of power, the question was no longer really whether partition would happen. It was how and how fast. And how fast turned out to be the single most catastrophic decision in the entire process. Here's a detail that genuinely deserves more attention than it usually gets. The original target date for British withdrawal from India was June 1948. Mountbatten, facing rising communal violence, growing British political pressure at home to exit as quickly as possible, and his own conviction that any delay would only make the eventual chaos worse unilaterally, moved that date forward by nearly a full year. The new deadline, August 15th, 1947. Ask yourself what that decision actually did in practical terms. It gave the British administration roughly 10 weeks to divide not just a political map, but an entire functioning state. The military, complete with its regiments and officer corps that would now have to be split along religious lines, the civil service that administered hundreds of millions of lives, the treasury and its assets, the railways, the police forces, and, most catastrophically of all, the physical land itself, house by house, village by village, in the most densely populated and religiously mixed regions of the entire subcontinent. Government archives, libraries, and even office furniture had to be physically divided between the two new capitals, in some cases literally down to individual filing cabinets and typewriters, in the few short weeks available. Why would anyone compress a task of that magnitude into 10 weeks? The honest answer, according to most historians who've studied Mountbatten's reasoning, is that he believed a fast, brutal transition would ultimately produce less bloodshed than a slow, drawn-out one, that prolonging the uncertainty would only give communal tensions more time to fester into open civil war. Whether that calculation was right is a question historians still argue about, nearly 80 years later. What isn't in dispute is what it meant for the man tasked with actually drawing the line itself. His name was Cyril Radcliffe. He was a distinguished British barrister, chosen specifically according to the British government's own reasoning, because he had no prior connection to India whatsoever, and therefore no bias toward any of the parties involved. He arrived in India on July 8th, 1947. He had 5 weeks. Sit with that timeline. 5 weeks to divide roughly 450,000 square kilometers of territory, home to some 88 million people, along the most sensitive, contested, and consequential religious and political fault lines of the entire subcontinent. Radcliffe had never visited the regions he was dividing. He relied heavily on outdated census data and maps that, in some cases, hadn't been updated in years. He chaired 2 separate boundary commissions, one for Punjab, one for Bengal, and in both provinces, the Hindu and Muslim representatives on his own commissions deadlocked so completely on where the lines should fall that Radcliffe ultimately had to make the final calls almost entirely alone. Think about what that actually meant on the ground. In Punjab, his line ran directly through a province where, in a staggering number of districts, no single religious community held anything close to a clean majority. Sikh communities in particular found themselves bisected almost precisely down the middle, half ending up in Indian Punjab, half in what would become Pakistani Punjab, despite the Sikh community having no state of their own on either side of the new border at all. In Bengal, the calculations grew even more tangled. Radcliffe assigned the Hindu-majority district of Khulna to East Pakistan, while keeping the Muslim-majority district of Murshidabad inside India, a decision driven less by clean religious demographics than by practical concerns over preserving Calcutta's access to the Ganges river system. Justice, in other words, sometimes lost to plumbing. Radcliffe submitted his final boundary award on August 12, 1947, and then something happened that, in hindsight, set the stage for the disaster that followed. The British government sat on Radcliffe's completed map for 5 full days. India became independent at midnight on August 15, 1947. Pakistan had become independent the day before, on August 14th, timed deliberately so Mountbatten could personally attend both ceremonies. Millions of people across the subcontinent poured into the streets that week, celebrating the end of nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule, and not one of them knew, with certainty, which country they were actually now living in. The Radcliffe Line, the actual boundary separating India from Pakistan, was not published until August 17, 1947. 2 full days after independence had already been declared. Some historians argue the delay was deliberate, a decision by Mountbatten to avoid the boundary controversy overshadowing the independence celebrations themselves. Others point to the sheer logistical difficulty of finalizing and printing detailed maps across an entire subcontinent in time. Whatever the precise reasoning, the practical result was almost impossible to overstate. An entire population celebrated the birth of 2 new nations without knowing which nation, on the map, they were actually citizens of. Ask yourself what that uncertainty did to a population already primed with months of rising communal tension, rumor, and fear. Because the moment that map finally was published, the answer became brutally clear almost immediately. If you want to understand exactly what happened in the days and weeks after that map was finally revealed, how a peaceful transition of power turned into the largest forced migration in recorded history, subscribe now, because what follows is the part of this story that gets condensed into a single paragraph in most textbooks when it deserves a great deal more than that. Let's keep going. Within days of the Radcliffe Line's publication, an almost unimaginable movement of human beings began. Muslims in what was now Indian territory began moving toward Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs in what was now Pakistani territory began moving toward India. And because the new border ran directly through some of the most densely populated regions of the subcontinent, these two enormous rivers of humanity were often moving through the exact same roads in opposite directions at the exact same time. Estimates of the total number displaced range from 12 to 20 million people. The most commonly cited figure sits around 14 to 16 million, making it, by a wide margin, the largest mass migration in recorded human history. They moved on foot, in ox carts, crammed onto the roofs and undercarriages of overcrowded trains, in columns that, in some cases, stretched for literal miles along the roads of Punjab. And as these columns crossed paths with one another, as villages that had lived peacefully alongside their neighbors for generations suddenly found members of the other community moving vulnerably through their territory, the violence that had already been simmering for months erupted into what can only be described as a decentralized, uncoordinated wave of ethnic cleansing. The image that came to define the entire catastrophe, repeated in account after account from that period, was the so-called ghost trains. Trains that departed one city, packed with refugees, hoping to reach safety on the other side of the new border, and arrived at their destination carrying nothing but corpses. Every passenger aboard murdered somewhere along the route, the train itself sent onward as a message. On September 22nd, 1947, in one of the most infamous of these attacks, a train carrying Muslim refugees was assaulted at Amritsar. Roughly 3,000 passengers were killed and another 1,000 wounded. 2 days later, in a direct reprisal, a Muslim mob attacked a train carrying Hindu and Sikh refugees at Kamoke, killing roughly 340 more. This pattern, massacre, then retaliatory massacre, then further retaliation, repeated itself across Punjab and, to a lesser degree, Bengal throughout the autumn of 1947, in a cycle that neither government nor the shrinking British military presence, still technically responsible for order, could meaningfully contain. Lahore, a city that had been home to a substantial and long-established Hindu population, saw that community reduced to barely 10,000 people as nearly 290,000 Hindus fled toward India in a matter of weeks. Entire neighborhoods that had existed for generations simply emptied. And there is a dimension of this violence that gets, even now, comparatively little attention despite its staggering scale. The systematics. Abduction and sexual violence inflicted on women during the migration, treated by all sides not merely as random atrocity, but as a deliberate weapon, an assault on a community's honor carried out through the bodies of its women. Historical estimates suggest close to 100,000 women were abducted during partition, with one commonly cited breakdown suggesting roughly 50,000 Muslim women abducted while migrating toward Pakistan, and roughly 33,000 Hindu and Sikh women abducted while migrating toward India. In the years that followed, both governments launched formal and deeply fraught recovery operations, attempting to locate and repatriate abducted women back to their original families and communities, operations that themselves became sites of enormous trauma, as many of the women involved had, by that point, been forcibly married, had children, or simply no longer wished to return to families that, in the era's brutal social calculus, sometimes viewed their return as a matter of shame rather than relief. Historians still cannot agree on a precise death toll for the entirety of partition's violence. The reason itself tells you something important about how total the breakdown of order actually was. Estimates range from a low of roughly 200,000 to as many as 2 million, with many serious historians settling somewhere in the 500,000 to 1 million range. The violence was so widespread, so decentralized, and so far beyond the administrative capacity of either fledgling government to track that no one, to this day, actually knows the true number. Behind those death toll estimates sits an almost equally staggering logistical catastrophe. What to do with the tens of millions who survived the crossing but arrived with nothing. Refugee camps sprang up on both sides of the new border almost overnight, hastily improvised out of army barracks, school grounds, and open fields, never designed to hold the numbers that flooded into them. One camp near Kurukshetra in India reportedly held several 100,000 refugees at its peak, briefly making it, by some estimates, one of the largest concentrations of displaced human beings anywhere on Earth at that moment. Disease spread through these camps rapidly. Cholera and other contagious illness likely killed additional thousands who had already survived the violence of the migration itself, only to die from conditions in the camps meant to shelter them. 2. Governments that were themselves barely weeks old, still assembling their own bureaucracies from scratch, were suddenly responsible for feeding, housing, and processing a refugee population larger than the population of many entire countries. Cyril Radcliffe himself never returned to India after completing his work. He refused to accept the fee he'd been offered, reportedly, unable to shake the sense of what his rushed 5 weeks had helped unleash. In an interview shortly before his death in 1977, 3 decades after drawing the line, he told a journalist that he suspected, if he ever returned, both sides would shoot him on sight. There's one more consequence of partition worth understanding in detail, because it shows just how far the violence reached, all the way to the one man who had fought hardest to prevent it. Mahatma Gandhi had opposed partition from the outset, arguing until the very end for a single, unified, secular India. When it happened anyway, he did something almost nobody else in a position of national leadership was doing at that moment. He walked directly into the worst of the violence, rather than away from it. He traveled to Noakhali in Bengal and to Calcutta, regions convulsed by some of the deadliest communal rioting of the entire period, and in January 1948, weeks after independence, he undertook a hunger strike in Delhi specifically to pressure both communities in the capital toward peace. The fast worked. Delhi's violence measurably eased while Gandhi refused food, and community leaders on both sides pledged, in his presence, to restore calm. But Gandhi's insistence on even-handedness, his refusal to treat Hindu suffering as more legitimate than Muslim suffering, his public advocacy that India honor a financial settlement of 550 million rupees owed to Pakistan under the terms of partition, even as the two nations were actively fighting over Kashmir, had made him, in the eyes of a small circle of Hindu nationalists, something closer to a traitor than a peacemaker. Among them was a man named Nathuram Godse, a former RSS volunteer who had watched the Direct Action Day riots and the Noakhali massacres, and concluded that Gandhi's nonviolent philosophy amounted to one-sided appeasement, asking Hindus to absorb violence rather than answer it. On the evening of January 30th, 1948, 12 days after breaking that final fast, Gandhi was walking to a prayer meeting in the gardens of Birla House in New Delhi when Godse stepped out of the surrounding crowd, fired 3 shots from a small pistol concealed in his hands, and killed him at close range. Gandhi's last words, according to witnesses, were, "Hey Ram, ask yourself what it says about the sheer force of what partition had unleashed that even the country's most revered." Independence leader, a man globally associated with nonviolence, became one of its casualties, killed not by a stranger to the cause, but by someone who believed, with total conviction, that stopping the bloodshed was itself the crime. There's one final piece of this story that deserves particular attention because, unlike almost everything else described so far, it isn't history. It's an active, unresolved conflict today. British India was not simply a collection of provinces directly ruled by London. It also included over 500 semi-autonomous, princely states, technically independent, whose rulers were now, with the British withdrawal, given a choice: accede to India, accede to Pakistan, or attempt to remain fully independent. Almost all of them made their decision within weeks. One did not. Jammu and Kashmir, ruled by a Hindu Maharaja presiding over a Muslim-majority population, sat precisely on the geographic seam between the two new nations, and its ruler, Hari Singh, hesitated. In October 1947, Pashtun tribal militias, backed by the Redrew Pakistani military, invaded the state, attempting to force the issue by conquest. Panicked, Hari Singh signed the Instrument of Accession, formally joining India in exchange for military assistance. Indian troops were airlifted into Srinagar on October 27, 1947, and what began as a tribal incursion escalated rapidly into the first full war between the two newly independent nations. That war didn't end with a peace treaty or a resolved political settlement. It ended with a United Nations brokered ceasefire that took effect on January 1st, 1949, establishing what came to be called the Line of Control, a military ceasefire line, not an internationally recognized border, that still divides Kashmir between Indian and Pakistani administration today. India and Pakistan have fought 2 additional wars substantially over this same unresolved territory since, including the Kargil conflict in 1999, and both nations, which have possessed nuclear weapons since the late 1990s, continue to maintain heavily militarized positions along that same line of control to this day. Ask yourself what that means. The single most dangerous, unresolved flashpoint between 2 nuclear powers on Earth right now traces its origins directly back to a princely ruler's indecision during a 5-week partition process conducted by a man who had never been to India, using outdated maps, under a deadline moved up by nearly a full year for reasons of political expediency. Nearly 80 years on, hundreds of thousands of troops still face each other across that same disputed line, in one of the highest and most militarized terrains on the planet, over a question that partition itself was supposed to have settled and never actually did. In roughly 10 weeks, a subcontinent of nearly 400 million people, an interconnected civilization with centuries of shared trade, shared irrigation systems, shared cities, and countless intermarried families, was divided by a British lawyer who spent 5 of those weeks working from outdated maps he'd never verified in person. The border wasn't published until 2 days after the independence it was supposed to define. Somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people died in the violence that followed. 14 to 16 million more were displaced in the single largest forced migration in recorded human history. Close to 100,000 women were abducted, their bodies treated as territory in a conflict that was, at its heart, about territory. And one unresolved piece of the puzzle, a single princely state whose ruler hesitated for a matter of weeks, became the seed of a nuclear-armed standoff that is still to this day actively unresolved. Most borders in history get drawn slowly, contested over generations, refined by treaty after treaty, war after war, until something resembling consensus eventually settles into place. This one didn't have that luxury. It was drawn in 5 weeks, by one man, under a deadline that had been arbitrarily compressed by nearly a year, and the human cost of that compression is still being paid in Kashmir. Specifically, 3/4 of a century later, it cost the world's most famous advocate of nonviolence his own life, murdered by a man who believed peace itself was the betrayal. And there's a particular kind of tragedy in how avoidable so much of this feels in hindsight, and how inevitable it must have felt the people actually living through it in real time. A few more months of planning. A boundary commission with the time to actually walk the ground it was dividing. A publication date that didn't strand an entire population in 2 days of complete uncertainty about their own citizenship. None of these fixes would have been difficult to identify, even at the time. Radcliffe himself said as much decades later. And yet none of them happened, because the political and administrative pressure to simply be finished with India, to hand over the keys and depart, outweighed, again and again, the pressure to get the details right. Speed was treated as a virtue in a process where almost every consequence of speed turned out to be measured in human lives. So here's the question I'll leave you with. When a colonial power withdraws in haste, prioritizing its own political convenience over the century of complexity it's leaving behind, who actually inherits the consequences? Not the officials who drew the line and went home, not the government that moved the deadline forward, the people who had spent generations building shared lives across the very fault lines that line would eventually cut straight through. If this gave you a deeper understanding of how one of history's largest human migrations actually happened, subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you think a slower, better planned partition could have avoided the worst of this violence, or was some version of this catastrophe always going to happen once the decision to divide was made? I want to know what you think.